Alrighty, so today we are talking about grit and bear it, the role of social culture in elevating levels of grit in adolescence. So the purpose of our study is to synthesize all literature on grit in order to explore implications on school culture and teaching practices. And so some of the guiding questions we had going into the study is what effect does grit actually have on performance of students? What factors actually contribute to levels of grit? And how can we use this research as teachers to become better teachers? So our agenda for today's conference is first, we're going to define grit. We're going to talk about how it's measured, its different dimensions. Then we're going to discuss different moderators of grit. And then we're going to apply these studies to instructional practices, both at the middle and high school level, as well as offer suggestions for classrooms and teachers. So to start off, what is grit? Grit is defined as passion and perseverance to achieve one's long-term goals. It's defined by Duckworth, who is a very notable researcher and expert in the field of grit. Grit may be an important factor in deciding whether one acts in ways that bring about success, and some of the different factors of success include academic, professional, and effort regulation, success in all three of those. And to be clear, grit differs from related personality traits such as conscientiousness because of its emphasis on stamina. And so because of that stamina piece, it is not just a personality trait, but it is in and of itself a characteristic. So we propose that potential moderators of grit include gender, school culture, classroom goal structures, and self-efficacy. And we looked for research to support our predictions.
To go a little bit deeper into the way Angela Duckworth and other researchers tend to think about grit, we need to understand both the multiple dimensions of grit and also the psychological assets that make it up. So as Sarina mentioned, grit is about passion and perseverance. We'll refer to passion as consistency of interest. It's what some have called the linchpin of grit. And the assets that stem from consistency of interest are interest and purpose. So although passion is important to grit, it's not a prerequisite for the development of grit. So if you take, for instance, the game of chess, in which passion derives from the game's complexity, which you don't really get until you have already persistently dedicated yourself to the craft, until you're further along in your study of the craft. Or take endurance athletes, for example, who tend to complexify our understanding of passion. Rather than finding their passion in running 26 miles, their motivating passion might be they want to push their body to the limits, or the satisfaction and accomplishment that comes from such an undertaking. So that's one side of grit. The other side is perseverance of effort. Okay, here we note the idea of resilience, the ability to overcome and persist in the face of adversity in relentless pursuit of a goal. This is a behavioral persistence, so a continued commitment to improve. And the two assets associated with this part of grit are practice and hope, both of which we'll talk about shortly as it pertains to adolescence.
Great. And so another question that we asked as we headed into our study of grit is how is it measured? And so once again, we turned to Duckworth and we learned that oftentimes in research, grit is measured using the grit scale. And here is a sample of it. And you will see a lot of those aspects that Julian was just talking about evident in this scale. So we see things like the persistence and we see things like interest evident in some of these questions, including things like I have overcome setbacks to conquer an important challenge. I am diligent. I never give up. My interests change from year to year. And so this scale is often given as a survey for participants to fill out based on themselves. And again, is used to help measure the grit.
So just to kind of frame our research as we get more specific into the those specific moderating factors that we looked at, Kind of thinking about why people study grit. So, as Sarina talked about earlier, grit is connected to both academic achievement and professional success. So, Angela Duckworth and other sort of early researchers of grit actually argue that grit is a better predictor of success than IQ. So people are really, really interested in ways that you can encourage grit in others because it seems like it has these sort of huge, important effects on people's entire lives. Sarina also mentioned this briefly, but grit is connected to the big five personality trait of conscientiousness, and we'll discuss this later, but there's a little bit of debate about whether or not it's sort of just like another facet of conscientiousness. Maybe it's sort of the same thing, or maybe it's this completely separate personality trait. Kind of connecting back to, again, why people are interested. Grit is a non-cognitive variable. So like I said, it's something that's actually not connected to someone's intellectual capability at all. It's completely separate. And so as teachers, this is really interesting to us because grit is something that we can encourage in all of our students, no matter where they are on the spectrum of intellect. And that's something really valuable, especially when we're thinking about ways to have an inclusive classroom. And right now, in the field of grit, there's kind of a debate as to what makes up grit. So like I said earlier, is it its own distinct personality trait? Is it a combination of several personality traits? So we can kind of think of the two-facet definition that Julian just gave us. And maybe it's even just another word for an existing personality trait like determination. And so looking into the specific research that we're going to discuss today, we chose studies that looked at the interaction between grit and other factors. And we did this because in our developmental psych class, we've been studying a lot how context matters. And as teachers, context is something that we often have control over. So the context of our classroom, or maybe even the context of our school. So we want to look at the ways that these other factors can be influencing grit and hopefully come out of it with some clear solutions for how we can encourage grit in our students.
The first piece of research we're going to analyze is this large grit meta-analysis study that was done last year. So basically in this meta-analysis study, they assess associations between grit and academic achievement in student samples to determine whether proposed moderators influence this association. And then the study kind of synthesized 137 previous studies about grit in the last decade. So it was all kind of recent information. And this took up a huge sample size. So using all these studies, they were able to use all the students in those studies and have over 285,000 students in their sample size. And in their study, they found that grit is positively associated with student academic achievement, like most of these other studies found, or how Marie and Sarina mentioned earlier. But they also wanted to figure out kind of these moderators of grit. Do these moderators kind of shape grit? Do they shape academic achievement? And they looked at 4 specific moderators in the study: culture differences, educational level, type of academic achievement, and gender. So the first one was this culture differences. So culture kind of shapes people's attitudes and beliefs, and they thought that could play a role in academic achievement. And they kind of looked at 2 broad aspects of culture. They looked at kind of this collectivism, or collectivistic culture, and an individualistic culture. And they kind of describe Western culture as more of this individualistic culture, where people have kind of individuals and goals, while Eastern culture is more collectivistic. And it's characterized by people having high value and harmony and kind of valuing the best principles to society more than to themselves. And originally, the study hypothesized that perseverance of effort towards success is going to be a more cultural norm. Grit's going to be more cultural norm in collectivistic cultures, while students in Western cultures are going to have kind of only grit in those specific classes that they find interested in, and they're not going to really, if they struggle academically, they aren't going to really see it as affecting more than just themselves. However, this study proved that this hypothesis was not true, that basically there was no significant cross-cultural differences in the strength of the association between grit and academic achievement. The second one was educational level. So does a grit shape kind of the academic achievement differently, whether it's primary, secondary, or post-secondary schools? And there was not much of a difference between whether it was elementary or college. High school had shown slightly higher levels of grit, but it wasn't very significant. And they believe that it was slightly higher just because there's such an emphasis on getting into good colleges. So maybe students in that area possess more of a grit or show more of a grit. The type of academic achievement. So they wanted to find if the type of academic achievement, whether it's like ACT or SAT or a standardized one, GPA, would affect the, if the amount of grit some students have would be more positively associated with a standardized test or a non-standardized measurement. And they found associations of grit and academic achievement were significantly stronger when non-standardized measures like GPA compared to standardized academic measurements. So in these studies that showed grit and this association with grit and academic achievement was much higher when they tested it on GPA or grades compared to grit and ACT and SAT scores. And then they wanted to see if gender had a difference. So is gender a moderator in grit achievement relation? Like, would a greater proportion of male or female students in a sample result in stronger relationship between grit and academic performance? And they did not find a significant difference between genders in the study.
As Peter just mentioned in the article he discussed, there's something to be said about the relationship between grit and academic achievement. And as Marie mentioned briefly earlier, the discovery of grit stems from thinking about IQ. One of the key questions that motivated the initial researchers of grit was, why do some people with similar IQ reach their potential and soar while others fail to achieve nearly as much? And so one of the key findings that help to understand both of these things is that grittier people may be more inclined to participate in what's called deliberate practice. Okay, deliberate practice is the more effortful and less pleasing activities that improve one's abilities. And more than innate talent, one's willingness to engage in these practices contributes to world-class performance. There's a belief that it takes roughly 10 years of deliberate practice for someone to become an expert in something. For an example, take a basketball player. One type of practice might be playing games over and over again. However, someone partaking deliberate practice might recognize a weakness in their game, like left-handed layups. And instead of playing a game, work on their left-handed layup. Okay, there's a higher probability of failure with this shot than the shots the player is more comfortable with, but grittier players know that they will improve because of working on that shot. Okay, gritty individuals are not deterred from their goals by failure or failure to succeed in these types of practices. They're not deterred by a lack of positive feedback as long as there's some interior hope, and they're not deterred by limited instant gratification. They work hard intentionally and consistently in pursuit of their goal.
So next we're going to look at grit and goal theory. And if you're a 29 listening, you're going to learn more about this in your educational psychology class later, but you'll get a little rundown now. So I was looking at a paper that was published this February, so very recently, that was asking one main question. So it was asking, why do some students exhibit more grit than others? And then it kind of got into the secondary question that's a little bit more foundational, what is grit? And so I'll discuss kind of the answers to both of those today. So Julian touched a little bit on how motivation affects how people persist in a task. And so when we look at a classroom, motivation is really, really important. And when we're thinking about why students complete work or why they engage in schoolwork, why they turn in their homework, why they study for tests, etc. And goal theory tries to understand how students' differing types of motivation affects their academic performance. So when we're thinking about goal theory, we're going to think about two main types of goals, and those are mastery goals and performance goals. So an achievement goal is a goal that someone has as a person. There's also something I'm going to talk about, which is classroom goal structure, and that's the kind of goal that a teacher is trying to encourage in their classroom as a whole, so like in the whole classroom community. But achievement goals, so this is just someone's individual approach to education. So like I said, achievement goals can be divided into two different types of goals, mastery goals and performance goals. And I really liked the article had some quotes that kind of summarize what someone with this goal orientation, how they would think about school. So someone with a mastery goal orientation would think it is important for me to understand the content of this course as thoroughly as possible. And you'll notice that in their approach to school, there's actually nothing about grades. There's nothing about being better than other students. There's nothing about trying to be at the top of their class. They approach school from the angle that they want to master the content. That's why it's called a mastery goal. On the flip side, the other type of goal is a performance goal orientation. And a student with a performance goal orientation is very concerned about how their learning affects the way that other students perceive them. So you can divide performance goal orientation into two separate orientations, performance approach and performance avoidance. So the article describes someone with a performance approach orientation as saying, my goal in this class is to get a better grade than most of the students. And anyone who's ever been in a class with a curve, you've probably felt that way yourself. It's not that uncommon. And the other one is a performance avoidance orientation, which is I worry about the possibility of getting a bad grade in this class. And sometimes performance avoidance orientations can also look like you worry about seeming stupid in front of your peers or something similar to that. And in this study of goal theory, people have determined that students with mastery goals succeed more in school. And I'll talk about a little bit more why that's related to grit. But in this study, they looked at this kind of organization of goal structures in 500 college students, and they were examining the way that a student holds either performance goals or mastery goals. How does that line up or not line up with their level of grit? So this study gathered data from these college students using 3 surveys. So first, they took a survey that asked them questions that determined their individual achievement goals. So are they mastery goal oriented? Are they performance goal oriented, etc. Then they answered questions that asked them about the classroom goal structure. So that did they feel like their class in general was more competitive and sort of pitting students against each other, or did they think that their class focused more on mastering of content? And then finally, they surveyed students for grit using the short grit scale. So the scale that Sarina showed us earlier, they used that to determine the student's level of grit. And so like other studies, they found out that overall mastery goal structure led to the best results. So like I said earlier, students who hold the mastery goal structure, while they're not as concerned about grades, kind of counterintuitively, they actually end up performing better in classes because of this focus on mastering content. And interestingly, they pointed out in this article that classroom goal structures matched student achievement goals. So students actually internalize the goal structures of the classes that they're in. So if they're in a class that's competitive and pitting each other against each other, they're probably going to lean more towards a performance goal structure. And there's kind of there's a parallelism between those two things. And in relation to grit, it found that students who displayed a mastery goal orientation also displayed higher levels of grit, and that there was not the same relationship between grit and achievement goals. And while this study was looking at college students, Peter is going to talk a little bit later about a similar study, and that study found very similar results in middle school students. So this can be applied to students that will be teaching as ACE teachers. But also this article got into a little bit about the overall definition of grit, and they were kind of questioning it, especially pushing up against Duckworth's definition that Sarina talked about at the beginning. And they argue that grit is actually not a higher order construct. So they don't think it's a combination of perseverance of effort and consistency of interest. They think that these two things are not necessarily working together to define grit. And so they argue that before more studies on grit can be done, we need a little bit better of a definition of what grit actually is.
Great. And so Marie started us off in thinking about some opposing views and questioning whether grit really is all that. So Usher et al. Found in 2019 that students who tend to persevere when the going gets tough will not necessarily perform better in school unless they also perceive themselves to be academically capable. And so in other words, grit cannot fully explain academic success without consideration of learners' own perceived capabilities and other social cognitive factors, such as the ones Peter touched upon in his study. What this article suggests is that students' individual grit alone is not enough to significantly affect academic performance. This invites us to look at how grit actually interacts with other factors like self-efficacy and school culture to promote success. And so we do that. A study in 2020 found that grit dimensions correlate positively with student self-efficacy, which establishes a supportive role by then impacting mastery and performance approach goals. So similar to what Marie was saying, grit does have a positive association with academic performance, but that association is through self-efficacy because grit has a direct effect on self-efficacy. And so self-efficacy actually increases the positive effect of mastery and performance approach goals and reduces the negative effects of avoidance goals. These mastery and performance goals enhance the academic performance of students. So what does this look like? Here is a model of what it looks like, and it's broken down into those two dimensions of grit, consistency of interest and perseverance of effort. And so through this model, we could see that first, perseverance of effort was actually more influential than the consistency of interest in promoting self-efficacy. We could also see in this model that grit positively correlates with mastery goals and performance approach goals, while it also negatively correlates with performance avoidance goals. This all in turn impacts the academic performance. In this study, it was measured by GPA.
So starting to look at some of the ways we can apply this understanding of grit to our classrooms, we're going to think first about at the middle school level. So this is a picture of my 7th grade class from last year. In middle school, it's a really important time for metacognitive development and also developing executive functioning skills. So as middle school teachers, we should be taking time to explicitly teach our students both metacognitive strategies and executive functioning strategies. And grit is actually a really important factor in both of these things. So grit helps students understand how their interest is actually going to influence their success in an academic subject, and also their ability to persist in a task is going to help them to complete their work as well. So when we're looking at some specific facets of executive functioning skills, so these are kind of like subtypes of executive functioning skills, planning, prioritization, task initiation, sustained attention, and goal-directed persistence. All of these are factors that would be influenced by someone's grittiness or their level of grit. And as I mentioned earlier, grit is a non-cognitive variable. So as teachers, it means it's something that we can and we should encourage and grow in all of our students, regardless of their academic ability. And this is really important at the middle school level because students in middle school can start to kind of internalize their role as maybe a bad student, and they can kind of give up on themselves at this time. And also peer relations are really important. And so if they perceive their peers as thinking that they're stupid or something like that, it may kind of lead to them to create a negative self-image around their own academic ability. But we know that grit is not related to your kind of inherent intellectual capability, but it's actually something that everyone can grow in. So we can encourage grit in our students across the board, and hopefully that will give them a little bit more pride and a more positive self-image when it comes to academics. And finally, just kind of one specific way that you can do this is use something that's called process praise. So this is a praise that combines praising a student's effort and praising a student's strategy. So sometimes we think about praise as we either praise a student saying, oh, you're so smart, or oh, you're such a hard worker, but both of those kind of have drawbacks. So when you praise a student for just being smart, they're not really putting forth any effort. But often when you praise a student for just their effort, they interpret that as you not thinking that they are intelligent. So process praise solves this problem because you praise the student's effort, but you also praise their strategy. So maybe like their problem solving skills or some kind of unique approach to a text that they had. And that kind of praise is better internalized by the student, and they have a more positive reaction to that type of praise. And that type of praise actually encourages mastery goals, which is growing a student in their grittiness too. So all these things are kind of building off one another.
Well, maybe the measurement of grit has is not perfect right now. We've seen through these studies that it's obviously very influential and strong associations with academic achievement. So we need to ask ourselves how we kind of foster grit in students. And Marie just kind of mentioned how to do it at the middle school level, and the high school level is very similar. So research has shown that students who perceive their schools as emphasizing mastery goal structures are going to demonstrate more passion, more grit for long-term goals. This more grit will then lead to higher grades, higher ACT scores, higher GPA, and hopefully more academic and professional success down the line. So how does a teacher, how do schools kind of develop these mastery goals or this mastery goal orientation? And it is similar to what Marie just said. You need positive reinforcement, and you really want to praise their growth. So not just their effort, not just what they did, but praise their growth. And you want to create an environment where students kind of develop interests, push themselves, and take risks. So a big factor of grit is kind of resilience or perseverance. You want your students to not be afraid to fail, to kind of pursue their interests and continue trying to challenge them as they go on through their academic career.
At the whole school level now, one massive way to improve grit in students is to have gritty faculty. Students often learn grit through the example of their teachers and the adults in the building. As Marie mentioned at the beginning of this, one of our key motivators is our understanding that context matters. And as we see from the Dan Chambliss and the Angela Duckworth quotes on this slide, there's a contextual aspect to grit. When everyone around you is gritty, you tend to become grittier. So quite simply, if you want more grit in students, you have to hire grittier teachers to be role models. However, administration can also support teachers' grit by continuing to feed the fire of their passions. Strong professional development and professional learning communities seem to help in that regard. And further, there's a recent study on school culture and grit that found that the 4 aspects of a school's culture, namely high expectations, collaboration, supports, and relationships, are conducive to the development of grit. And to many, when you read those 4 aspects, you start to think of teachers who are warm demanders. And so once again, returning to the classroom level, we'll present a few recommendations about teaching as a warm demander and establishing a classroom culture conducive to grit. Okay, the first is that adults should show that they care, and they should further show that they care through their high expectations for all students. Second, failure and mistakes must be an encouraged and celebrated part of the learning process to encourage students to take up deliberate practice. We talked about the benefits of that earlier in the presentation. When students aren't afraid of failure, they're more willing to attempt challenging problems and not lose hope in their goals if they're unsuccessful, which connects back to the idea of self-efficacy. Also, students should have multiple opportunities to improve their work and receive assistance from both teachers and fellow students. In the grit framework, everything, even a summative assessment, is an opportunity to learn and continue to improve and grow closer to your goal. So there needs to be more opportunities to improve students' work. And then finally, teachers should use the strong relationships that Peter mentioned to include student interests, values, and goals in the curriculum, which will help foster the consistency of interest or passion side of grit.
And so in conclusion, the question that we ask is, what can you do as an educator, as someone who works with adolescents or young children? And so according to Duckworth, once more, you can do these 6 practices to help improve levels of grit in yourself and in your students. These include clarifying your goals, discovering your interests, practicing deliberately, knowing your purpose, practicing optimistic self-talk, and joining and maintaining a gritty culture. And if you do these things, you yourself can become grittier and instill grit in your students. Here are our references.